Welcome back, everybody. It's 12 minutes after. President Obama today released his plan to repair the U.S. financial system. It is the biggest overhaul of market rules in more than 7 decades. But did it go far enough? Well, joining us here to tackle that question and some others is John Coffey, a securities law professor at Columbia Law School, our own Margaret Popper, who covers the banking sector. And also with us from Washington, D.C. is Doug Elliott, a fellow of economic studies at Brookings Institution, and also from Washington, our Washington Bureau specifically, Jesse Westbrook, our own SEC reporter. Welcome, everybody. And Professor Coffey, I want to start with you. I mean, there's some discussion about whether or not this went far enough, or did it not, did it go too far? What do you think?
I think essentially it went as far as they thought it was politically feasible to go. All morning I've heard this described as visionary, revolutionary, sweeping. I would describe it as moderate, sensible, essential, and in many ways quite modest from where we were 6 months ago. And behind all that, I think, are political constraints that they realize. There are things Congress wasn't going to do. We may get into this later.
Right.
But there are several basic political compromises in terms of what they do and do not do in this proposal.
Right. In terms of things that they didn't do. Jesse, I want to bring you into this. There were some questions about what would happen to the SEC. Would it be merged potentially with the CFTC? In terms of the SEC, what do you think?
Well, I think that Professor Coffey is right, and the SEC-CFTC lack of a merger is a direct result of those congressional fights. The Agriculture Committee, which oversees the CFTC, relies on campaign funds from Wall Street to win their elections. They don't want to lose that jurisdiction. That would have been dead on arrival in Congress. So it was negotiation, it was compromise, so you have two regulators remaining separate that probably should be combined.
And Margaret, those big banks obviously watching this very closely.
Well, one of the huge issues here, and Professor Coffey, I'd be interested in your take on this power for the Fed to regulate anybody, and this isn't just banks, but any company that poses systemic risk, and no mention of how you measure that risk, no mention of who gets to decide who's in that category. And this could affect, a Walmart. Doesn't have to be Citibank.
It is rather broad, Professor Coffey.
Well, I think what they're talking about are those corporations that have what I'll call industrial loan banks. General Motors, General Electric. They have large financial institutions as subsidiaries, which could pose systemic risk. Walmart is pushing it, but
they've got a huge credit card operation. They applied to be a bank.
But the most important thing is this power doesn't go to the Fed without some constraints. The administration knows that the Fed is not popular in Congress today. Congress is very upset with how the Fed handled the AIG crisis and the bailout. As a result, they've created this new body, the Financial Supervisory Oversight Council. And they mean it to be primarily a consultative group, but Congress means to share the Fed's authority. And there may be some attempt in Congress to give veto powers to this Financial Supervisory Oversight Council.
Doug Elliott, you're down in D.C. I want to bring you into this. From what I understand is you really think that the president should have gone farther in his proposals.
Yes, I mean, I'm actually generally fairly pleased, but I really think it's a shame that there wasn't a move to cut down the number of regulators even further. You have essentially 6 types of regulatory bodies with the banks, and it's kind of an insane system at this point. With this big a crisis, it would have been nice to cut down to something more like 1 or 2 or 3 at the most.
Jesse, you're down in D.C. Why do you think the president didn't propose that?
Well, as we said earlier, Congress wasn't going to go with that. These agencies have powerful constituents. They have a lot of experience sort of utilizing the gaps in regulation and structuring themselves in a way to entice regulation by a specific agency. And Congress benefits from that, too, because it allows them to raise campaign funds, as I said before. I think what Obama decided is there's some immediate things we want to do to restore confidence, and getting into some of these political fights, it's not worth sacrificing those things that you really want to do to engage on these political fights.
Well, and Jesse, the news from Bankland is that small banks tend to favor the FDIC as their regulator. The big banks, of course, are used to the Fed. And as you point out, all of them are used to playing their regulators off each other. Several of these banks have several regulators and have always existed in that environment. And as one banker said to me, it's like kids who know when you want a certain thing, you go to mom. You know, if you want a new dress, you go to mom. But if you want ice cream, you go to dad. Well, that's how you play your regulators as a bank.
Right, and I think there's a lot of questions about whether that is going to be resolved under the Obama plan. My first instinct would be no, it won't be. It's going to continue.
Doug, what do you think? Will it be resolved?
I am concerned about it. I mean, they're making some efforts. For one thing, the largest banks and other financial institutions will be regulated ultimately by the Fed. So you'll have a single sort of top regulator for those. And the financial, the Oversight Council is going to try to mediate some issues. But no, I'm concerned about it. And the problem is 10 years from now, when we have the next crisis, we may find there are new financial instruments that are now being regulated by whoever the softest regulator was.
And John, I want to bring you into this because one of the things that you said, I think one of the major compromises is dealing with derivatives.
Exactly.
And I mean, I think if I'm watching this and listening to what the president's laid out, I mean, this was the kind of the root of the problem here. And yet, what have we done here in the president's plan?
If there was any major, highly visible debacle, it was the failure of AIG. And we all know that Congress took authority away from all regulators in 2000 so that over-the-counter derivatives traded without any regulatory supervision. And the AIG collapse was a direct product of that. Now, what's going to happen is that we will have either exchanges or clearinghouses provided for the trading of over-the-counter derivatives. But so far, all the administration is saying is that those derivatives that are standardized should have to be traded through a clearinghouse.
And that's an important distinction, right?
Sure, the distinction here is between standardized and customized. And that line is not self-defining. It creates a huge incentive for all the major banks to declare and design their products to be customized and thereby to escape federal regulation through clearinghouses.
And Margaret, those banks that are watching their, kind of profits being squeezed here, they're going to look for ways to make new money.
Well, one of the ironies of this, of course, is that that is exactly what banks and investment banks and hedge funds do. They take the rules as they exist, and they see how they can get to the outer edge of the envelope there and use that to make money. And they don't do that, intending to do wrong, but they definitely try to use the existing rules to get out to that edge there where they can make money. And that's how you ended up with securitization gone wild. CDS has gone wild.
Right.
We could well end up there again. We just don't know what it'll be called.
The devil is in the details.
Right.
We've heard a very broad, abstract level proposal from very intelligent people who tend to function at the high, abstract level of economists. The lawyers and lobbyists will be fighting the details.
All right. And obviously, lawmakers are going to be working over those details. We got to take a break, everybody. About 20 minutes after, we're going to continue our roundtable. When we come back, stick around.
The absence of a working regulatory regime over many parts of the financial system and over the system as a whole led us to near catastrophe. We shouldn't forget that. We don't want to stifle innovation, but I'm convinced that by setting out clear rules of the road and ensuring transparency and fair dealing, we will actually promote a more vibrant market.
All right, we're back with our regulatory reform roundtable. John Coffey, professor of securities law at Columbia Law School, our own Margaret Popper, Doug Elliott, a fellow at Brookings Institution over in D.C., and Jesse Westbrook, Bloomberg's SEC reporter, also in the nation's capital. I want to go right to a viewer email who wrote in. This was Carlos, and he says, was the almost zero interest rate by the Fed back in 2003, 2004 a cause of the credit crisis and distorting calculations of risks and leverage in finance? And he says, how could the Fed manage systemic risk after creating it in the current crisis? Doug, let me throw that out to you. Good point.
It is a good point. You'll find there are actually a range of views about it. I do think it was a factor. I think they felt they had to keep rates that low, but doing so, it certainly made it feel like it was almost free to take risk, and that led people to do some stupid things.
John, is it too close in terms of, the Fed, everybody says, where was the Fed when all of this was unwinding, yet here we are giving it more power to kind of oversee everything?
Well, I think the Fed did make mistakes. So did the SEC. What I think is most important is to have a politically accountable regulator. We need a future in which if a bank fails, you can say, That regulator made a mistake, and that regulator should be replaced. Right now, we have this Byzantine network. It's a Himalaya of different regulators, each having its own little peak, and no one can be held accountable because everyone has shared responsibility. So political accountability begins with telling one agency it's responsible, and if a major bank fails, it will be on your watch and you'll be in trouble.
All right, one other key issue I want to get to, we were talking in the break about the issue of banks having to hold more capital. I mean, Jesse, this has got to be a contentious issue, no doubt about that.
Well, I think that banks are going to resist having to hold more capital when times are good, because that's money that they have to keep on the sidelines and can't be using to make more profits. On the other hand, hopefully they get the message that if you're not holding money during the good times for the bad times, you may end up like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers when the bad times roll in. But it is going to be a contentious issue. Anything that cuts their profitability is going to be a fight with Congress and with the administration.
Well, and Jesse, part of the issue is not just what the banks do in good times, of course, but if you force them to raise capital in times like now, bad times, you are in essence sucking credit out of the system, because if they have to raise capital, they are not going to be lending. I'd be very curious to hear what Doug has to say on the implications of that for the economy, kind of when this bill might go into effect and what that does to the recovery.
Yeah, I imagine what they're going to do, though they haven't said it, is that they'll phase in the capital requirements just to deal with that very issue. But I have to say, I am definitely a proponent of higher capital requirements. And I'm a former banker, so I'm certainly sympathetic to the industry. But I think we pretty clearly proved here and elsewhere that not having enough capital creates so many more problems than having a little too much that we've got to rebalance.